Just weeks to go now to the beginning of the Summer Olympics in Japan. Preparations, though, have been hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. And as many as 80% of the Japanese say they want the Olympics called off, but the Japanese government and the International Olympic Committee insist the huge event will go ahead, even if there are no foreign spectators and the athletes compete in empty stadiums. Many are wondering what's the point? And are giant sports events like the Olympics perhaps a thing of the past? Here on To The Point, we ask Tokyo Olympics, games at any price? Well, thanks very much for joining us here on To The Point, where my guests in the studio are the much-travelled Deutsche Welle sports reporter Barbara Moore, who says that for most athletes there's simply no alternative to the Olympics. If the Games don't go ahead, their world will fall apart. Also with us is Hayo Seppelt, a leading authority on the machinations that go on behind the scenes in the world of sport, not least in the world of doping. He says the IOC's main interest is to secure its billion-dollar income by making sure that the Games go ahead. And a very warm welcome to Finn Meyer-Kuckuck, East Asia expert and former Japan correspondent, who argues that the Tokyo Games might already look like a failure, but Japan will make the best of a very challenging situation. Thank you, all three, for being here today. Thank you for those introductory comments. I'd like to begin with you, Finn, with the first question. How important are these Olympic Games for Japan and the people of Japan?
They were meant to be a liberation from the shadow of Fukushima. Especially the younger generation today doesn't know so many events in Japanese history at all. They only know about nuclear devastation and a tsunami. And originally it was meant to clear up the Japanese image, and all this is now turning into a disaster, admittedly. But there's not much alternative now to plowing through and making these games without spectators work.
That is a dark vision of the days and weeks to come, Finn. Barbara, how important are the Games for the IOC, the International Olympic Committee?
Oh, for the Olympic Committee, of course, it has a high importance because lots of money is depending on these games. And then again, of course, for the athletes, it's extremely important because they have been training for years. Many of these sports, they don't usually get the attention outside of the Olympics. Take canoeing or take taekwondo, all these smaller sports. Yeah. So it's extremely important for those athletes that they get the chance to compete in front of the world.
So for you, there is no doubt that the Games should go ahead?
There is no doubt that they will go ahead for me, actually. I don't think we're in a point of time where there is a chance to cancel them. And I do think in the eyes of the athletes, it's also important to have them going.
Hayo Seppelt, we've got this remarkable figure of 80% of the Japanese population apparently against the Games taking place. What have the Japanese authorities, the Japanese organisers of the Games got right so far? And what have they got wrong? How do we explain this figure of 80%?
It's very clear. The pandemic situation in Japan is very, very worrying. There are not enough vaccinations. Most of the people are against these games because they think they are not at the right time taking place now. So they think they should be postponed another time to 2022, from my point of view, for good reasons. Because, as I said, the risk is very high in the moment.
You think the games should be
again postponed to 2022?
It would be traumatic for the Japanese people, one presumes. Finn?
The major downside would be they would land in the same year as China. So it would look like a co-hosted double Olympics by Japan and China, and we know they are arch enemies.
It's a fascinating point, yeah. OK, well, normally the idea is that the Olympics can give a big boost to the host country, promoting positive national pride and bringing people together. But as we've seen, there are serious doubts over whether that is what is happening in Japan. Let's have a look.
Protests and petitions are unusual for Japan, but opposition to the Olympic Games is growing. According to polls, 80% of the Japanese population are against them. Seeing how many people in the world have died from corona has completely changed my mind. I feel sorry for the athletes who are training so hard, but holding the Olympic Games in the pandemic? No. I want them canceled. Tokyo's state of emergency has been extended until July 20th. The vaccination rate is still minuscule, not to mention warnings from doctors about variants. But coronavirus is not the only reason for this opposition. The Olympic and Paralympic Games are being used to cover up the aftermath of the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster and to show the world that the problems there have been resolved. This is a lie that we cannot tolerate. Is the Japanese government trying to hide its own shortcomings?
Finn, just tell us a little bit more about all this. Is it really a cover-up on the part of the... Are they trying to distract attention away from the doom and gloom of Japanese society, the government, or is it a cover-up that we're seeing here?
It's not a dark conspiracy to cover up Fukushima with a sport event. It's just a PR move, a very big PR move on the side of the former Japanese Prime Minister Abe, who was seeing the Japanese image going downriver quickly for so many reasons, and who wanted to change something about it. That's fair enough, but now the pandemic came, and so this Olympics is overshadowed by a second disaster.
1964.
Yes. This is an important date. It was a chance for Japan to show, after the Second World War, that they are back among the group of civilized nations. They could show they are technologically advanced. The Shinkansen high-speed train made its first run from Tokyo to Osaka in record speed. No other train on the planet was as fast back then. Everybody was in a good mood, and I think Japan wanted to repeat this little miracle of recovery after starting Second World War in the Pacific. Now, after Fukushima, and everything went wrong because of COVID.
And do you think that there is any opportunity, you seem to indicate this in your statement at the top of the show, that the Japanese people will come together and there will be a surge of enthusiasm and positive feeling around the Games?
It is quite improbable that there will be like an enthusiastic wave of support for the Games now. The numbers just tell us it won't be that way, but I think the Games will take place, and they will take place in an orderly fashion that at least will show that the Japanese are able to organize something like this under pandemic conditions. A different message, but also a message.
Yeah, talking of messages, the Games have traditionally been used to project the image, Hayo, of a host country, that the host country has of itself. That's a perfectly legitimate thing to do, is it not?
It is, but to be honest, it's about the athletes. It's about the Olympic spirit, so-called Olympic spirit. It's not about a country. Wherever athletes go, they want to compete, they want to win medals. They can do it at every place in the world. So I don't see any reason why we have to do that this year, why we have to do it in Japan. We can do it, as I said, a year later. It would work. But I know that Thomas Bach, the German president of the International Olympic Committee, doesn't want that because he thinks he cannot afford these efforts anymore. And also it's a question of money, it's a question of insurance, because if the Games will be cancelled by the IOC, then maybe they will have a loss of income at the very end. And it's also a question. From my point of view, it's not about the athletes. It's not about them. Bach said...
You have said the athletes are the means to an end.
Exactly. Because I think it's about the billions, dollars, euros, the income caused by the TV rights contracts, by the sponsorship contracts. This is what counts for the IOC.
So when people say it's all about money, they're right.
To be honest, yes.
Barbara.
I don't even disagree in this point. I just also want to give the perspectives of the athletes who have no alternatives to these Games. It's just how it is. There is no equal competition that gives them the same attention. So they depend on these Olympics taking place. I totally agree that they could have been postponed one more time, but it's too late now. I mean,
and when you talk about the athletes, these are have you been talking personally to athletes?
Yeah, we have been following several athletes over the past year, also making a documentary here at DW about their path. And I have just last weekend, for example, I've been filming with an athlete competing in Taekwondo, and he's of course hoping so much that these competitions are going to take place because he has invested everything into going there.
And when we talk about the atmosphere at the Games, you were in Sochi. And you were also in London.
In London and
for example,
in Rio.
as
Yes.
my favourite games. No coincidence, I suppose. London, it was great. Just tell us about the atmosphere, the two different narratives there of those games, Sochi and London.
Yeah, and Rio. I've also been to Rio, and it's absolutely. It's the atmosphere is very different depending on the place it's taking place. London was a great atmosphere. You could also actually the population has been very skeptical ahead of the games, but then once they started, there has been a great spirit. So many people from different places coming together and celebrating the athletes. Sochi was far more reserved, I would say, and Rio was again something else. Already struggling financially, the country. You could also totally notice the difference already between the World Cup and the Olympics, I would say, from the atmosphere, and still very open. Once the game started, everybody was celebrating.
Finn, is there any sense that the people of Japan actually believe in the games? Because I use the word narrative there. It's something you have to believe in. And in recent years, we've had power politics, we've had corruption, we've had doping, which has been investigated, and there's been huge exposures. Have the people in Japan lost their belief in a major project of this kind?
They were never really too enthusiastic about that. It was charismatic Prime Minister Shinzo Abe who made Japan want the games. Now he's gone politically, and COVID came instead. So it was a difficult sell to the Japanese public to begin with. The situation is so different from 1964 because Japan doesn't have to prove anything anymore. Money is important. It's an aging society. Suddenly costs play a role, especially as the Fukushima aftermath is also very expensive, and the energy transition. So, the public was always reluctant, and now the mood has entirely turned against the games.
There was an age of innocence there implicated pre-1964. Has that age of innocence now perhaps disappeared forever? You've talked about these games possibly being postponed. Are we maybe seeing the end of, a whole story of the games that has, taken decades, over 100 years?
I'm not so sure if you can talk about a past of innocence. Let's talk about the 36 Olympics in Germany and Berlin, which have been abused by the Nazis in order to show the whole world that Germany is a so-called peaceful country, which hasn't been the case, as you know. So I think propaganda was always a problem for the Olympics, and it's still used. And, for example, Sochi in 2014 was a very, very huge example for how you can make propaganda with the Olympics. Just have in mind that 2 weeks after the Sochi Games, the Crimea was occupied by Putin. So you know what has happened in the time of the Olympics. They were preparing for the invasion just in the time of the Olympics.
Let's just be accurate. Annexed.
Annexed. Sorry. Sorry.
How could sports have stopped that? I mean, you're putting a lot of burden on sports now. How can sports fix all these problems? Do you think Germany would not have started the Second World War, or Russia would not have invaded Crimea?
I didn't say that.
It would have cancelled the Olympics.
I didn't say that.
These events.
No. I'm not saying that this had any connection with the Olympics. What I said, they used the Olympics in order to distract from political whatever consequences from political behavior. That's what happened, and that happened in 36. Jewish people haven't been allowed on the streets before the Olympics, 36 after the Olympics, but during the Olympics, all these signs on the streets were gone, and they later they have been there again. So in Sochi 2014 or Beijing 2008. In the time of the Olympics, it was a peaceful atmosphere. But what happened afterwards, it's a completely different story.
Maybe it's not about sports stopping regimes, but the question is, do we give them the stage and the possibility for sports washing in the end? I think that's a critical question.
OK. Moving on just a little bit, before the Games in Tokyo get underway, there is, of course, the big kick-off in soccer's European Championship on the 11th of June, another event that was postponed for a year because of the COVID pandemic. Now, all the matches are taking place in existing stadiums, from Munich in southern Germany via the Russian city of St. Petersburg to Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, 4,000 kilometres away. It's not clear how many spectators will be at each match, but there are concerns concerns about so many fans being on the move around the continent. Barbara, the Euro 2020 organisers have been working hard to create a positive buzz around the tournament. Have they succeeded in doing so?
I'm afraid I'm a bit more sceptic about the Euros even than about the Olympics.
Oh dear.
First of all, I do believe it's a big challenge to have this competition spread over so many different places, meaning that fans will always only gather at one location, and now we also know due to the pandemic even that is going to be difficult. So I don't really expect like big celebrations or this special atmosphere that you would usually get with these tournaments. And yeah, still, I'm quite sure it's going to...
Do you expect the atmosphere at the Euro 2020 Championship to be similar to Tokyo in the sense that, I mean, we're having to get used to empty stadiums. I think we have done.
We have done so.
But are people going to accept that in Tokyo at the Games there?
It is so sad because, well, the whole point was they built hydrogen filling stations, hydrogen gas stations all over the place to show the world public how advanced Japan is. All this was in vain now. So the PR side of the event is completely botched. And I think nobody here would think that that sports events without spectators should be the norm going forward. Right. I mean, this is the exception in a pandemic, and is not a model for...
It will be different at the Euro because there are spectators, as it was a precondition from the European football or soccer body, that they said only with spectators, at least a certain number of spectators, you will be allowed to host these games. So it's a little different. So we will have a kind of atmosphere at the Euro, but we won't have it, I guess, in Tokyo.
And when you compare the two, the games and the huge soccer tournament, what do we learn by comparing the two?
I think we cannot compare them. Totally different thing. Olympics are with many sports, different sports disciplines at one place, and they should be at one place from my point of view, because that is a so-called Olympic spirit. Football you can play everywhere. It doesn't matter, because if you look at on the TV screen, it doesn't matter if it's in Moscow, if it's in Berlin, if it's in Munich, wherever it is, it's the same more or less. So I don't see a big difference, except one thing: we had the so-called Fanmeilen and German celebrations on the streets during big tournaments. We won't have that this time, and it will never happen if you have a tournament which is spread all over different countries. That's a disadvantage.
This is the point, the decentralized nature of the tournament. Is that a future for major competitions?
I do believe in a little smaller form, yes, spreading it over like 2-3 neighboring countries. I definitely see an advantage in doing that. I think in this case here, it's a little exaggerated.
Well, can events like the Olympics or the Soccer World Cup still be a format for the future, a vehicle for reconciliation and even peace, or are they too big and too politicized?
Sochi 2014, the Winter Olympics, where the closing ceremony was as massive as the price tag. These were the most expensive games to date, costing around $50 billion. The IOC thanked President Putin, and shortly thereafter, Russia annexed Crimea. In China, too, the world became an autocrat's guest, first at the 2008 Summer Games, and next year when the country will be hosting the 2022 Winter Games. The sports facilities are new, but the politics remain unchanged, whether it's the suppression of the democratic protests in Hong Kong or the internment of Uyghurs. Now, the IOC insists that it has human rights in mind. That's also the shared view of World Soccer's governing body, FIFA, which wants the 2022 World Cup to be held in Qatar and praises the reforms made there. However, many immigrant workers have died during the construction of stadiums in the desert emirate. Should such major events be awarded to authoritarian regimes?
It's a big, tough question, Finn. Should major events of this nature, like the Olympics, like the World Cup, be awarded to authoritarian regimes?
In my opinion, the answer is yes, this should happen, because we are one world community on this planet, and a big part of the world is not ruled democratically. And why exclude them from the sports world? We are doing so much trade with China. We could cut off many other ties, culturally, economically. why reduce the reaction to sports? Why deny authoritarian countries the possibility to host games?
Should we give authoritarian countries? I mean, I'm saying we. Who are we to make? You know, this is a. Should authoritarian countries and nations be given a stage for authoritarian politics, for making their case?
If the situation in these countries is too worrying, it's too bad, then I would really say, okay, it's not possible. You cannot do it in countries where you have a very severe violation of human rights. That's my opinion. But I'm with you. I say you cannot exclude them at all. But you should use leverage. Because you have power as a sports body, and you can use a leverage to say, okay, you have to fulfill at least some criteria in order to make sure that these games will be held under, let's say, conditions of free speech, of press freedom, for example. And if this is not the case, I would say, okay, then you cannot bid for the Olympics. This is a precondition, or for the big championships. But at the very end, I agree, you cannot exclude them at all.
In aspects that directly relate to the games, like the construction projects or so, I think IOC should enforce higher standards. But should the precondition be, I don't know, high ranking on the democracy index? Probably not, right?
No, I said, for example, you should make safe, make secure the free speech, press freedom, for example, that people are allowed to write and report whatever they want in this country before and during the games, just to give you one example. And that is not the place in some countries, and that is, for me, very worrying. And against, by the way, against the so-called human Olympic spirit.
There's a lot of talk of a boycott of the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing, for example. Is that, you know, how much of a blow would that? You're shaking your head.
It's too late. It's too late. I think that would have been discussed, would be needed to discuss beforehand. Let's say 7 years ago, 5 years ago, but not now. You cannot do that now. It's simply too late. As I said, they should have used their leverages in order to reach some level, at least, of, let's say, a liberal spirit in these games beforehand. They didn't, and now it's too late.
You still have situations like in Belarus, for example, of course, when the situation is getting extreme, that on a short notice you decide to withdraw the event, like the hockey World Cup, for example, which was supposed to take place in Belarus. But in general, of course, it's important to negotiate the conditions ahead of giving away the Olympics, deciding where to take place.
And do you think, Finn, that the big sports can be part of the solution or part of the way back from the setback, the global setback that the corona pandemic has been?
Certainly, yes, because sports brings people together. We have been in a situation that separates people in everyday life in between countries, and sports events will be more important than ever to go back to normality and project a sense of well-being in the community of nations. Yes, so it's more important than ever.
I would agree with respect to sports in general, because it's a cultural value, a global cultural value, which we have to respect. I'm not in favor of supporting sports organizations who are doing this job, because they have a very anachronistic structure in many federations, and I'm really very skeptical if these organizations are the right bodies to organize big events.
And then again, there is no alternative right now. Like, the Olympics are still the only worldwide event where people from every corner of the world are participating, and people from all over the world are also watching. So if there is any chance of bringing people together, I think it is the Olympics, not in Tokyo, because nobody will be there, but still watching from all the different parts.
How sterile are these games going to be?
They are going to be very sterile. There are very strict rules, not only like corona tests every day, but also a strict separation. I believe athletes and journalists are not allowed to take public transportation, to get in close contact with the Japanese population. Also, the athletes can only stay there for a very short time, which means that right after the competition, I think within 48 hours, they have to leave the country again, which means that they are not able to gather, to party, to be there at the closing ceremony in the end, which is also a very emotional moment usually.
Hugely important for these athletes. Yeah, yeah. It's the high point of their careers very, very often.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Is this going? There's always this thing at the end of the Olympics that we get the statement, "the best Olympics ever" or whatever. You know, where are these Olympics? Are they going to be bottom of the pile?
They will be at the very, very, very end of the Olympic history, I guess. At the very end.
Okay. We'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much for joining us. We've been talking about the Tokyo Olympics. Are they going to happen? What's the mood going to be? Thanks very much for joining us. Thanks very much to my three guests as well. If you've enjoyed the show, come back next time. Bye-bye and tschüss.